And welcome, part 2 of 2048, Diamonds in the Rough. Thank you for joining in on the reading tonight. I know it went 2.5 hours last night and probably will do the same tonight. Hopefully we can get through the remainder of the book, but it may hold over until Sunday evening's live stream. But at any rate, thank you for allowing me to do something that's a bit of a departure from our typical live streams. As you know, yesterday I said that I had received a number of requests from people to read my novels, and that's not something I ordinarily am equipped to do. I don't really have the voiceover talent, so to speak, to act the character parts, but we kind of got through it last night, and hopefully we'll get through it this evening without my voice disappearing on us, and I will try to make it as pleasant an experience as I'm able. Have a little addition to the group here. There's Steve Irwin. There's our manta ray. Okay, couldn't resist. There he is on the backside. Some people call them a devilfish. Well, I don't think that's appropriate. They're actually very mild-mannered, very meek animals. Okay? But there's Steve Irwin. There's our submarine. As I said yesterday, the British Royal Navy saw fit to award the gold medal prize for their submarine competition, design competition. I believe, based upon my little book here, first published in 2014 and again in 2016. Be that as it may. What is it that they say about imitation is the highest form of flattery? Well, I don't need flattery. I don't need my ego being fed any more than it already is. Okay, so we will jump right into this, but I want to first acknowledge in Texas the flooding from the tropical storm, almost Hurricane Imelda, and upwards of 1 million people being affected by the devastating flooding that's going on down there. Plenty of damage, didn't need high winds to do it, just incredible rains. So prayers extended out. As well to our family of patrons here, those that are suffering illnesses and injuries and past operations and recovery and planned operations and procedures. You know, the old saying again, if you have your health, and that's so very true, and we all know that. So certainly prayers for all of the recoveries. My wife Kathleen will not be joining us this evening, but possibly later in the chat room, but not on camera or anything like that. So I thank you for joining us in the chat room. It looks like things are working okay. So give me the thumbs up in the chat room just to double check that we are in fact live and I'm not just sitting here running off at the mouth. Okay. So Michael or Pamela or Tamara, any of you in the chat room, if you can give me a thumbs up. Okay. Can you guys hear and see me okay? See who's paying attention. Doug from Diamond Digital Media, I know you're out there. Can you let me know if you can hear me? Okay, looks like I need to go into the chat room. Well, we shall see. Good. Thank you, David. David says we are live. Good, so I don't think we missed anything. I always like to just get it going, without much ado. But with some ado, let's go to Scripture. We like to begin our live streams this way. Ezekiel 5, verse 13, and when my anger is spent, I have vented my wrath against them. I will be appeased. And when I have spent my wrath on them, they will know that I, the Lord, in my zeal, have spoken. I'd like to read just a little bit more from that, if I may. Put it into context. Again, this is from Ezekiel chapter 5. And this is very familiar to all of you out there. But let me start with verse 11 just to give it a little context. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord God, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable idols and abominations, I myself will withdraw my favor. I will not look upon you with pity, nor will I spare you. A third of your people will die by plague, or be consumed by famine within you. A third will fall by the sword outside your walls, and a third I will scatter to every wind and unleash a sword behind them. And when my anger is spent and I have vented my wrath against them, I will be appeased. And when I have spent my wrath on them, they will know that I, the Lord, in my zeal, have spoken. I will make you a ruin and a disgrace among the nations around you, in the sight of all who pass by. And so you will be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the nations around you. When I execute judgments against you in anger, wrath, and raging fury, I, the Lord, have spoken. So I offer this to you, not to pick on Israel, but because of the elections. And Israel trying to form a coalition government, a collaborative government. I think we have to pay close attention to what's going to be happening, because we know that on the threshold right now is the so-called peace deal of the century, or deal of the century. And that was slated to be presented to the world in its entirety within a few days of the election in Israel. So a lot going on over there. I don't want to take too much time highlighting that. I've sent you numerous articles concerning the elections and activities in the Middle East. I'd like to go to another piece of scripture. And the reason that I'm also picking these out is because the storyline for 2048 Diamonds in the Rough takes place on the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, just off of the Syria, Jordan, Israel coastlines. And it's very strategic, and I would just offer to you, keep your ears open for activities on Cyprus in these coming weeks. I think because it's so strategically placed, it may factor in some of the activities. Okay? So Matthew 24, verse 37 is where I'm headed next. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you are unwilling. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you that you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay, that's just our backdrop. Again, I have the cover there, but I'll just put it up on camera. This is what you have been so gracious to allow me to go ahead and read tonight. We are halfway through the book. Hopefully we will complete it tonight. So without further ado, we will jump right into this. I'll back up a few paragraphs just to get us a touch point from where we left off last night. Immediately, Bibi goes for full elevation of his chair, Richard stretching on his toes, attempting to gain line of sight on the island's highest peak. How are they going to get it there? Too much gear to fly in it all at once. A bunch of air missions would draw a lot of attention. Convoy is all Jim offers, pointing to a highway bisecting the island. 00100 running west to east, Bibi lowering him, enabling him to trace it with an outstretched index finger. Stop, again is all Jim states. Bibi's finger comes to rest at the highest point. Of course, George having the benefit of watching every move they made inside the command center, courtesy of Steve. Mount Olympus. So there's a Mount Olympus right in almost dead center in the island of Cyprus. And I will give you a look at Cyprus here, okay, up on the screen, and we'll continue on. This is taking place inside the bridge of Steve Irwin, the sentient manta ray submarine, and this was a topographical map, a 3D holographic map that they were just observing. The audacity of these buggers, George not bothering raising his voice, more out of anger, preventing him from expending any more energy than necessary. I swear, we gotta get these guys. Letting it go at that. Go to bed, Jim nearly ordering George over their mantle communications link from the opposite side of the planet. Jim, Richard moving over alongside him. Easy. Quite okay, he's right, George giving them all a wave, pushing his rolling chair away from the workstation. We'll talk in a few. For now, game how to do this. Will do, BB cutting the link. What's with you? Richard stepping around the model, looking at the mountain peak. Simple, really, Jim sounding bland, looking blank. They're following in the footsteps of the gods. This brings everyone, crew alike, to give Jim a look like he's lost his mind. Not noticing, he points to the mountaintop. That's where 2048 will become sentient. Not a soul ventures a word. In ancient times, a temple to Aphrodite of the heights was erected. Women, by the way, were not allowed to enter, Jim's effect improving. This makes sense. How? Richard speaking up. The so-called ruling elite of our world see themselves as achieving godlike status. Simply a case of history repeating itself is all, Jim continuing to circle the model. Pride goeth before the fall, BB offering. Yes, Jim stopping at the eastern side of the island. Their belief in merging man and machine, Richard chiming in. Again, yes, they believe that by enabling the 2048 to become sentient by way of its artificial intelligence, it will help them achieve immortality. Really? One of the SEALs no longer able to remain silent. Yes, really, Jim finding humor in the deception of the elite. They're doing nothing more than believing that age-old lie proffered by Satan. Oh, they're doing a lot more than believing, BB finally back at deck level arising from his chair. I'm aware of this, Jim seating himself in his chair left of BB's center one. You seem to be aware of an awful lot, Richard taking up his own to BB's right. It's Steve's doing, BB smiling at Richard. Sort of an exchange program going on around here, gesturing his right hand in a circular motion about the sub's interior. You're kidding, Richard looking for some images or clues he's somehow missed. He is, and then again he's not, Jim taking up the lead for BB. Steve's been teaching me a lot while you guys slept. You've not slept since we've come aboard? Richard visibly angry with him. I will, shortly, Jim reassuring. Right now we need to prepare. For what? Richard again looking at the various holographic displays before them. I know we've a battle coming on Cyprus. In the meantime, did you have something else in mind? Not my idea, Jim rising from his chair. Whose then? Richard showing his irritation. He did not like feeling 2 steps behind. And by the way, what does Steve get in return for your exchange program, as you were all calling it? Growing up, Jim walking from one display to the next, not looking at Richard, as if appreciating fine works of art in a gallery. What? Richard on his feet at Jim's back, turning, facing his old friend. Steve is no longer 5. How old? Richard lowering his voice, but not his tone. 15. Jim pointing to a display, registering a waterfall of data morphing to the shape of a birthday cake with 15 candles alight atop it. Very funny, Richard nodded, amused. How old will he get? Richard stopping his words, turning to face the entire crew of the sub. Steve? Yes, Richard. The unmistakable sound of a 15-year-old voice. Crap. Why now the change? Richard raising his face as if expecting to see Steve looking down at him. Between Richard and Bibi, a new hologram appears. Is this better? Steve standing as a solid holographic image as before, only this time as a teen. Unbelievable. Richard sounding dejected. Look, stop playing around. This is serious. We've a mission to accomplish. Sorry, you're right. Steve's image disappearing. Jim, you and Steve go ahead with your exchange program. Just don't let it interfere. Richard alone moving back to the island model. It's necessary to our success, Bibi offering from behind Richard. We'll see. Richard leaning over the model, not bothering to turn. We've gotten this far undetected, Richard viewing their progress across the Atlantic, approaching the Mediterranean Sea. I'm expecting this won't hold true once we slow. True, Bibi, and he, along with Jim, all standing before the holograms. We will maintain propulsion using the Higgs drive, and for a while yet, its field will prevent detection. I still can't get used to this whole idea of us passing like gamma rays between atoms. I mean, intellectually I grasp our computer enabling us to move through the matrix of the Higgs field into an entirely different dimension. It's not like we've actually been shrunken down to a quantum level of existence. Not shrunken, true enough. George back on with him after napping for a few hours. Only passing through, or better explained as passing by, solid atoms. As you know, 71% of the universe consists of dark energy and 25% is dark matter. Less than 5% of what we consider solid matter exists. The remaining areas are ours to move about and explore, virtually undetectable. 20 minutes to exiting through the Higgs field, Steve announces. Your voice keeps changing, Richard chiding him. How old now? Same as my time announcement, Steve displaying a serious but nonetheless playful temperament with Richard. Hope you don't turn into an old man, George chiming in. Prepare for silent running. Just like the old days, Richard enjoying the anticipation of what is to come, although not entirely sure what to expect either. The time arrived. Standard operation in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Steve's voice going silent, only the holograms giving indication anything had changed. Coasting through the cold Atlantic waters, they approached the Strait of Gibraltar. I'm just trying to find a map for you guys. That'll give you some idea. They're coming in from the left here in the graphic through the Straits of Gibraltar, the southern end of Spain. Okay. Taking over propulsion, the leading edges of Steve's wings rhythmically ripple along at 30 knots. Silently, Bibi reduces their speed to 5 knots. Unhurriedly, they pass through the strait, entering the Mediterranean Sea itself. Pointing at one of the displays, Jim indicates a freighter dead ahead on their course. They didn't disturb the Med with HARP. Nodding in silence, Bibi, using his right index finger inside the hologram, guides Steve to beneath the ship's hull. Matching course and speed, they continue eastward toward Sicily. Incoming, Steve breaking off their self-imposed silence in a quiet and calm voice. Got it, Richard responding. So much for going undetected. Steve, get us away from the freighter, Bibi not wanting to endanger any innocents aboard the craft. Accelerating using his highly flexible wings, coupled with quickening movements of his tail. Steve sets a ferry angle of 45 degrees to starboard. Nice, Jim complimenting his tutor. You're welcome, Steve chimes in. Now battle stations, please, in his ever-deepening yet otherwise essentially unwavering tone. By virtue of his diamond construction, the torpedo in and of itself presented no real danger to Steve or his crew. The danger came in an intangible form, that of having been detected at all. They know we're here in their playground, Beebe announcing in his full voice. This time it's not in the sandbox, Richard making reference to Iraq and the greater Middle East itself. The situation topside steadily had progressed from bad to worse since their departing the Pacific. You gentlemen okay? George checking in. Yes, indeed. Beebe unfazed by the turn of events. Thank you for building such a great toy. Looking upward. Sorry, Steve. Steve does not reply. The torpedo turns, navigating toward the large target afforded by Steve's broad 300-foot beam. Harmlessly, it explodes upon impact. Reflexively, Richard calls out, "Damage report." Each and every one of the crew, including his own SEAL team, breaks out in laughter. Sorry, guys, Richard smiles. That was a test, George appreciating their moment of levity. They were not sure what they were dealing with, like a shark bumping an unknown prey. Now they know. Ah, but what do they really know? Richard tossing back. True enough, George not missing a beat. They know enough to know they don't know, if you follow me. Sure, they've never seen a target as large as ours, at least not underwater, save for the length of a sub of standard configuration, Richard answering. Nothing standard about us, Jim offering. And that, my boy, is precisely why their brief after-action report has by now rocketed to the highest echelon of leadership, George explains. A new game is afoot, Beebe, considering what must be going through the minds of their adversary. They know this much, Jim begins. From their perspective, we simply appeared out of nowhere. That alone has them scratching their heads. More like pissing in their pants, Beebe laughing, imagining the high-ranking brass and their elite leader soiling their fancy clothing. Loss of sphincter control, Steve announces, for once speaking without first being spoken to except when announcing an alarm. Sounds like we have ourselves a new adult on board, Beebe announces. Gentlemen, I give you Lieutenant Steve Irwin. A raucous round of applause erupts as yet a second, then a third torpedo explodes upon impact with Steve's diamond skin. Does that hurt? Jim's question instituting immediate silence in all the crew. Not at all, Jim, but thanks for asking. I'll let you know if and when it does, though, Steve enjoying the hearty welcoming by his friends. Make all speed to Cyprus, Steve, George issues from the silo. Gentlemen, I've detected their readying of several batteries of nuclear ballistic missiles, some aboard subs in your area, others land-based. We're really in for it, Beebe busying himself pouring a fresh cup of coffee. Black and strong, eh there, William? Richard extending a cup of his own. Right you are, sir, right you are. Things are about to go live here in a few moments. That stopped Richard, causing him to withdraw his empty cup. What's the matter? You a half-empty or a half-full kind of fella? Beebe actually surprised by Richard's reaction. What exactly do you mean by going live? You mean the nukes? Richard sitting back into his chair. Yes and no, Beebe leaning in, pouring into Richard's cup. Yes, they'll launch nukes upon our heads, and no need to worry. Hey, I know enough about that even diamonds cannot stand up to one nuke, much less a whole slew of them bad boys. Richard again withdrawing his cup, it now being half full. True enough, Beebe setting the coffee pot aside on the chart table behind their chairs, a member of the crew observing, removing it out of harm's way. Tell you what, how about you sit back and watch our newest LT do his thing, okay? BB beginning to drain his now tepid cup of coffee, much to his displeasure. Not giving in, Richard barely acknowledges the words posed to him. Play nicely, boys, George laughing over their mantle communication line. BB tossing his cup back over his head, nearly hitting the crewman removing the pot of coffee. Crap, George. Can't even enjoy my cup of joe around here with you guys. Jim, George unruffled by BB's half-joking remark. Yes, George. Jim off to one side of the battle of wits between BB and Richard. Bedtime, George enhancing a grandfatherly voice. Like to see the fight if I may, Jim neither surprised by George's direction nor upset. These two and their crew can handle what's coming their way. They'll need you later, George pointing aft via the holographic display of him standing in the silo. Yes, sir, Jim complying, heading to the crew staterooms to the rear of the command and control center. How's he going to get any sleep around here, Richard, appearing confused? Watch and learn, BB now positioning 3 individual holograms just beyond his knees in his chair. And keep quiet, shoving one of the displays over onto Richard's knees, impacting them. Right, Richard going silent as he examines the solid objects, meant to control some sort of weapons system. Those are defensive only, BB ordering him. Richard actually biting down hard on the inner wall of his cheek. Up until now, he considered himself in charge of their mission. He decided to see what BB was really made of. And as well, what the heck all the changes in Jim meant. Again, he was feeling 2 steps behind, and it royally pissed him off. By now, Jim was asleep in his rack. Actually, a very comfortable bed, unlike the bunks in a typical naval vessel. Unknown to him, Steve had seen to this, using a mild gas sedative within Jim's sealed stateroom. Nav, bury us on the bottom, BB orders his navigator, more out of tradition than necessity. He could just as easily have told Steve to do so for them, but he wanted to keep his crew on top of their game, just in case. In the mud. Aye, sir, their navigator replies from his seated position ahead of BB and Richard. Smoothly, and again without any audible sounds from inside or outside their manta, they descend to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, south of Sicily. The leading edge is rippling. The sub digs 100 feet into the soft sands. All stop, BB orders. Placing his hands inside one of the 2 holograms suspended over his knees, BB touches a solid representation of the seabed covering them. Now we get to go to sleep too, not bothering to gauge Richard's reaction with a side glance of his own. Richard watches as BB appears to be smoothing the sands over Steve's hull, represented as a small, solid model. A finger taps an icon displayed down inside the right corner of the display cube. We need to tuck in our blanket, BB grinning into the green, glowing images. The sands covering Steve immediately turning a bright blue within the simulation, then back to green, indicating the process being completed. Not able to remain silent any longer, Richard asks in a lowering voice, "What's this all about?" Steve's blanket of diamonds, BB only slightly turning his head, but giving Richard a smirk. I thought Steve's hull was impervious, Richard leaning in closer to BB. It is, but remember, we are still putting him through his sea trials. BB expanding the cube with his hands for Richard's benefit. Like a kid hiding under the blanket from the boogeyman, Richard giving BB a version of a smirk. No, not hiding, just being prudent. BB pushing the cube over to Richard, then rising from his seat. We could be here a while. Let's grab some chow. Richard expecting more private conversation away from the crew. Seated in front of a stack of fresh deli sandwiches, Richard begins, "You don't like to fight, do you?" "Only when necessary," BB downing a good hot cup of coffee. "And I don't like competition." "What does that mean?" Richard finishing half a roast beef in 2 bites. I believe in collaboration. Beebe stopping any eating or drinking of his own, leaning back a little across the table from Richard. You a pacifist? Richard baiting him. Not at all. Don't confuse the two. Beebe finding Richard more of an atypical SEAL than he'd first expected. But then he imagined this was part of why George had recruited this fighter. He knew Richard to be highly intelligent and possess many unique skill sets, including computer science. But as he could see, beneath him lay the heart of a competitive warrior. He knew he needed to change that up a little if they were to succeed here. Tell you what, Beebe began. Tell me what? Richard slapping down the remainder of his blood-red, rare roast beef, getting to his feet. Beebe, smiling, remained seated. Sorry, let me explain a couple of things. We got off on the right foot early on, but I can see I've slowly been bugging you. What of it? Richard grabbing a can of orange juice out of a stainless steel rack, nearly tearing off its metal top. He empties it, letting off a manly burp. We have to work together. The crew, your men and mine, don't need to see a breakdown in command. Beebe remaining in his seat, watching Richard's behavior. Agreed, but who exactly is in command? You? Richard nearly growling out the question. See there? This is what I mean. Not to get all philosophical on you, Beebe getting to his feet, but otherwise not approaching Richard. Then don't. Another burp, the fumes directed at Beebe. Competition means control, Beebe waving a hand across his own face. Controlling who? Richard finding a white powdered donut, something he'd not ordinarily eat. The competitors. Someone or a group controlling the competitors. Beebe moving about the galley area. You mean setting them up? Richard speaking through puffs of white sugar. Exactly, like footballers. Your version or mine makes no difference. In the end, merely entertainment for the masses. Beebe continuing his pacing about. No different than armies and navies. Richard swallowing another orange juice. Yes, the powers that be, those in control of the world's population, gain from wars, monetarily and, Beebe stopping his pacing, spiritually. They get power from creating fear and causing death. Richard done with his eating and drinking, looking Beebe straight on. See, we are on the same page, Beebe appreciating. Richard finally relaxing. The owners of sports teams are not unlike the elite class of this world. They sit back watching guys banging their heads together while reaping the real rewards. Same with wars, Richard moving back, retaking his seat while gesturing Beebe back onto his across the table. Glad you see what I do, Beebe offering his handshake. Richard accepting it. Learned that lesson quite a while back. Still got a temper, though, especially when I'm left in the dark without the intel I need. My fault. Shouldn't have strung you along without first briefing you. No excuses. Beebe turning his head upward. Steve, status, please. 16 low-yield tactical nukes dropped on us. Made a real mess of the med. A lot of dead fish floating around here. Steve sounding more like a cowboy in his middle 20s. Knock off the drawl, Beebe shaking his head, Richard laughing. Yes, sir. Steve back to his usual professional manner, albeit his voice deeper than even an hour prior. We're 100%, no damage, ready for your orders, sir. Care to drive? Beebe grabbing an apple and an orange from a stainless steel wire cage atop another of the galley tables. Which one you want? Always appreciate a fresh orange, Richard accepting the gift. Apple is what got us all in this mess in the first place. The two men moving forward to their seats in the command and control center. Once again, Richard is full of questions. Seated, he begins. I'd like to get back to how Steve was created, if we have the time. BB acknowledging his navigator. Once again, their sub moves from beneath the damage wrought to the sea and by the low-yield tactical nukes. Sure do. But first, anticipating another of your questions, how did, for the lack of a better word, the enemy detect us? Yes, that is a good question, Richard amused. We let them. BB noticing the looks from the SEALs joining them in the C&C. Didn't do us any harm, but why bother? They could be setting a trap ahead for us. This time with bigger toys, Richard maintaining his position in front of his men. True enough. That's why we covered ourselves with that nanodiamond blanket. BB activating another hologram. This one lay bare the essential blueprints of Steve. I'd be guessing to say it was the first deployment of the shield, Richard watching as the 3D blueprint is enlarged in front of the three men seated in the command chairs. You'd be right. I am confident it would withstand a direct strike by any of the largest nuclear devices. And yes, I'm equally confident there will be more. Now, to your questions regarding Steve. We'll have to take your word for it, Richard looking confident for his men gathered around the holographic display. I have a basic grasp of the whole nanodiamond concept regarding Steve's structure. George and you guys basically growing him from subatomic diamond crystals. Therefore, as he behaves as though he's alive, an actual life form. Richard pausing, expecting some comment from Steve himself. As usual, Steve remains silent unless first spoken to, or when providing a warning. Does he have blood as well? Let me change the image here for you. Does he have blood as well? BB chuckling. Yes, indeed. Excellent question. And it, too, is red. Does he bleed? Can Steve be injured? Richard feeling a little uncomfortable speaking of Steve in the third person, especially while virtually inside of him. Yes, that is, if his hull, his skin, could actually be damaged, which, as far as George and the rest of the team can tell, cannot. BB focusing the hologram upon a close-up of an elegantly simple pumping system, reminiscent of, yet not a replica of a human heart. That looks like a fern of some type, Richard impressed. Very good. Yes, indeed. In fact, it's taken from the Koru fern of New Zealand. The word is of the Maori people, symbolizing new growth, new life, strength, and peace. The outer circular shape conveys the idea of perpetual movement. The inner coils suggest a return to the point of origin. A perpetual pump, Richard holding the solid fern-like object in his hands within the hologram itself. We certainly hope so. Right, Steve? Richard speaking directly. Absolutely, Steve replies in the voice of a now 30-year-old man. And it expands by increasing the number of those similar inner spirals within the larger outer one. The more spirals, the greater the volume of blood moving through Steve's systems. Organs of some type, I'd imagine. Richard removing his hands as Steve demonstrates the expansion process. Right again. We believe the process, as the design implies, to be without limit in its capacity. Richard watching as Steve moves the heart model upward from within Richard's hands, allowing it to freely float in the midst of all the crew. In so doing, the model grows in size, allowing each of them a full view of the smaller inner self-replicating in rapid succession, the smaller spirals. And blood? Richard half expecting a green fluid to come spewing forth from the many tubes mimicking arteries and veins. Steve, please modify the hologram from green to your actual colors. BB stepping away from his chair, standing near the pumping fern-like heart. Immediately the display turns a bright ruby red rather than the more familiar crimson of a human. Steve, please explain the construct of your blood. Gladly. Steve's adult voice still a little hard for Richard and the SEALs to get accustomed to. The sub's crew, having expected Steve's development, find it amusing watching the SEALs' reactions. My blood, like my body, is made up of a crystalline structure. However, in this case, not nanodiamonds, rather salt. Interrupting, salt, Richard now on his feet. You mean to tell me you have seawater running through your veins? You really are a fish. Or are you a mammal? Never thought to ask. Mammalian. That is where I depart from the manta and stingray model, both being fish and not seawater. My salt is described scientifically as BP and NH2BdC2. O8 rather than simply O2. My O8 molecules are arranged in a molecular lattice in the epsilon phase of solid oxygen. Come on now, Stevie, old boy. Richard joining BB, standing at the free-floating heart model over the navigation chart table. I'm no biological engineer, nor my team for that matter. I think I can help explain. Returning from his brief nap, Jim standing opposite at the table. Taken aback, Richard remains silent, watching as Jim withdraws, using his fingers, a sample of the crimson blood pumping through the model. These are recombinant, class 1 molecules, Jim begins, then interrupted by Richard. Don't tell me you learned that in medic school. No, Steve's been teaching me, Jim smiles, continuing to break down the complexities of Steve's systems. Richard once again restrains his words. These are biomolecules formed of 4 units called terameric proteins, of which there are 2 subclasses, homotetrameric and heterotetrameric. And yes, for our purposes here, these proteins relegate Steve to being what we consider to be alive. No different in that respect to us. Steve, here's a new life form. Steve here is a new life form, one created not of genetic manipulation. He has no DNA in the common usage and definition. Rather, he has been grown from seeds, crystalline seeds, some diamonds, others salt. Hold on there, boys, Richard holding up both hands. No offense, Steve. None taken. I expected your reaction. However, shall we allow Jim to continue his dissertation? A hint of humor in Steve's voice. All right, I'll shut up. But a new life form? Richard not able to refrain from beginning to pace around Jim and the heart model. Jim answering, yes, a gift from one of George's friends at the University of South Denmark, a lady professor who sees the good in what science can do. This crystalline blood absorbs oxygen from its surrounding environment. Again, not unlike our own hemoglobin, exchanging carbon dioxide through the capillaries in the alveolar sacs of our lungs for oxygen. In fact, Steve's blood is absorbing oxygen from the surrounding seawater. Let me put up an image for you here. Hold on. Sorry, Richard almost stammering his words. I was going along with this whole new life form thing, but because I viewed it as a metaphor for this machine. Again, sorry, Steve, no offense, but you are made from diamonds and salt? And you? What substances are you made of, Richard? Steve calmly replies. I'll take that one if you don't mind, Steve. Jim feeling like he should get Steve off the hook, not verbalizing the obvious pun in poor taste. After all, this is my dissertation. Thank you, Jim, Steve replies in an appreciative manner. First, the essential macrominerals, given as first a percentage of the body, followed by the weight for an average 70-kilogram person. In the book, there's a list of all of the elements. Thank you, Jim, Steve adds, and as you can see, Richard, you're made up of much more than mere diamond and salt crystals. Jim, what's happened to you? Richard finally coming to realize just what sort of lessons he'd been receiving from Steve. Jim smiles. Something else you all should know concerning Steve's blood. Jim looking about the CNC room. It'll instantaneously suck all the oxygen out of a room. His voice returning to somewhat his norm, tossing the holographic blood aft towards their crew members. No one says a word. Finally, Jim continuing with his explanation of Steve's blood, George and his team have successfully formed the salt or solid oxygen 8 into the form of DS-red, a reporter gene, thus causing it to fluoresce red like blood due to its reaction with the catalytic enzyme luciferase. Sounds demonic, Richard blurts out. Sorry again, Steve. Steve does not respond. I thought you said Steve was not grown from DNA, but from crystalline seeds, Richard quickly filling in the pregnant pause. Not missing a beat, Jim continues. Correct, to a point. You see, Steve is also somewhat like a plant. Okay there, Jimmy boy, Richard stopping and turning to face the younger man. First, Steve is a machine, an artificially intelligent one at that, and probably sentient from what I can tell. Yes, Jim allowing Richard the floor. Yes, to which? Richard about to totally lose all patience. Oh, never mind. You guys are beginning to confuse me. Beginning? BB tosses out. Sorry. Do go on, old man. Scowling, Richard picks up where he'd left off. A machine. Next, a new life form. One not of DNA as we know it. But he is a mammal? Or so he says of himself, Richard catching his breath. And to top it all off, he's also a plant? Care to explain that one, Jim, or BB, or even you, Steve? Once again throwing up his hands, turning from the group. I'll continue, Jim spreading a sample of Steve's crimson blood across the chart table's surface. Immediately begins growing a fern. Remember his heart? Jim's voice flat. Turning, viewing the plant. Are you telling me not only his DS-red crystalline blood, a form of hemoglobin like ours, but he obtains additional nutrients and energy through photosynthesis like a plant? Exactly, BB exclaims. I do hope you remain on our side, Stevie, old boy, Richard, not amused. I understand your concerns, Richard, Steve friendly. Oh, really? You ever see the movie 2001? Never mind, I'm sure it's in your memory bank somewhere. I'm not anything like the HAL 9000, Richard, and for the record, I don't have memory banks. Steve's tone hinting at irritation with Richard. Oh, pardon me, that's right, your brain is all diamonds. Richard suddenly stopping his diatribe and looking directly at both Jim and Richard. A chill running down his spine at his self-actualization of thought. Unlike in the movie, I don't care if you can hear my words or, for that matter, read my lips. Go right ahead there, Steve. Richard taking his chair, facing away from the crew, still standing around the chart table and the holographic fern-like heart hovering over it. You guys, you do realize we are all inside the proverbial whale that swallowed Jonah, don't you? Crossing one leg over the other, holding it with both hands as he bounces it upward. Man, you're kind of losing it, BB stepping around in front of Richard. Knowing these two could come to blows with each other, Jim intercedes. I see your point, Richard, but no need to fear Steve. Richard raising his head upward, his back still to Jim at the table. Really? What makes you the expert, young lad? Because I've seen the inside of his mind, Jim coolly letting the words sink in. Richard slowly uncrossing his leg, places the foot squarely upon the deck, rising to his feet and turning toward Jim. Care to elucidate me on that one too? Equally cool. Jim remaining both at his place against the chart table and even in his answer. We share a common form of data storage, memories, if you will. That third strand of DNA, I thought Steve didn't have any DNA, Richard maintaining an even level of inflection. Correct, he does not. However, we share in a diamond crystalline structure. Jim moving from the table over to the front of the room at the bow section of the sub. Come again? Richard thinking back to Beebe's earlier explanations, searching. My third strand is composed of nanocrystals of diamond, remember? Jim's words becoming tinged in condescendence. Oh, right, Richard's voice trailing off in thought. If I may, Beebe stepping in toward Jim in front of Richard, we have a mission to contend with. Take my word for it, Richard. I've been with Steve since his inception, and there's nothing to fear from him. You mean his conception, don't you? Richard letting his temper level off, recalling why they were there in the first place. Smiling, recognizing the humor in the moment as well as Richard's improving disposition. Now, Richard once again regaining his chair, motioning to both Jim and Beebe in the retaking of their own, casting his face upward. My only question, from whom did he spawn? Letting the words bounce off the ceiling, as if ensuring Steve did not miss them. Steve, Jim watching the two men uneasily settle back in their respective chairs in the CNC room. Do you think that 2048 AQC is still aboard the 00100 barge? Yes, why do you ask? Steve replies in a rather academic exchange with his now of equal age protege. Wanting to ensure that they're not offloaded, wanting to ensure they've not offloaded it during their attempt at a diversionary tactic, deploying those nukes upon us, Jim, in a pondering, not fretful manner. It was us who purloined the diversionary tactic by allowing them to first detect our presence, then to attack us in a manner of their choosing, Steve in a most professional voice. What the heck are you two doing? Richard leaning to his left in his chair, nearly in Beebe's face looking toward Jim. Ignoring Richard for the moment, did they succeed in distracting you? Not in the least, Jim, Steve sounding preoccupied. All while you three were playing with my heart, I was performing my duties as a watchman on the wall, so to speak. Jim turning in his chair towards Beebe and Richard. I guess he's pretty good at multitasking after all. That breaks the tension in the command and control room. Wouldn't be much of a supercomputer if he wasn't. Beebe appreciating Jim's return to a more normal demeanor, as well as their own. Steve, as if he really needed to gain his attention. Are these buggers still tracking for Cyprus? Or have they changed their mind after seeing we were still alive and all? Maintaining course and speed, the HMNB-1 and the 00100 remain intact. And as I said, with the 2048 still aboard, Steve reporting like a first lieutenant. Very well, surface, Beebe ordering. Why, is all Richard cares to ask. No need to hide, of course. Thought we'd get a breath of fresh air is all. Beebe rising from his chair, heading for the upper access hatch. They won't bother trying to hit us. They're still sizing up our capabilities. Speaking of fresh air, what's our air supply like? I mean, you must have CO2 scrubbers on this as in any other sub, right? Richard half knowing the answer will not be a simple one. No scrubbers. We got our oxygen from Steve. He gets it from the ocean. Beebe again enjoying needling Richard. Moving upward along a ramp rather than a ladder in a typical sub, Beebe remarks, You're wrong about being in the belly of Jonah's whale. Beebe turning, looking back over his right shoulder at Richard. We're in his lungs. Arriving at the sub's topmost ceiling. Where to now? Richard seeing nothing but unbroken hull overhead. Where's the hatch? Not now. Radiation and aerosolized chemical contamination at lethal levels here. BB looking directly over his head at Steve's nearby skin. Bubble, please. Slowly the skin begins deforming, bulging upward at first as a shallow circular bubble. Gradually it gains both in height and circumference until achieving a diameter of 30 feet. That's better. Room to breathe, you might say, BB stepping up into the new space. Richard choosing to remain silent and watch. Go for it, Steve. BB watching Richard as he gazes around the hemispherical space. His eyes at first narrow as if trying to refocus, not sure what he's seeing. Then go wide, his body involuntarily turning toward BB. That's not possible. Slowly at the same pace as the bubble's formation, Steve's skin begins to transform, becoming at first translucent, finally, literally, crystal clear. They say diamonds are a girl's best friend, BB thoroughly enjoying the childlike look of amazement having taken over in the Navy SEAL captain's face. In this case, a man's. Never in a million years. Richard at a loss for further words, moving quickly about the transparent dome riding atop what would pass for a stingray's head. For the first time, Richard is able to gauge the sheer speed of their craft. Before him lay the open Mediterranean Sea. Together, they stood nearly 60 feet above the roiling waters. They've created these storms, BB calmly remarking as Richard stops alongside. Hurricane forces at least, Richard still unsure. Off the scale, BB activating a navigational hologram in front of them. How is it we're not feeling any motion? Any motion? Richard instinctively raising his voice, as if to overcome the storm's fury. Recall that we are passing through, using the Higgs field as our shields. BB manipulating the solid objects inside the navigation station. A bubble inside a bubble? Richard's voice returning to normal, a little embarrassed. Yes, now look here. The HMB-1 and its 00100 barge have docked on the Syrian side of Cyprus. BB enlarging the solid-scale model of the island, the two vessels appearing as mere toys against it. Just bringing up a map. No, well, we'll just use that. How'd they get through this storm? Richard looking around the display at the storm outside their window. It was generated behind them by HARP and a local floating NexRad rig. Anything out here has long since sunk. We're now going to slow. Why? Jim arriving inside the dome. Richard, a little startled by his sudden appearance, being distracted by the storm and the fact he does not seem at all surprised by the view. Recon, Richard offers up. Yes, indeed. I'm not at all confident Cyprus is our final destination. It may only be a leaping off point for them, BB stepping back, allowing Jim a better view inside the navigational display. I thought the whole idea was for them to install that 2048 as soon as possible, to get its AI capabilities fully operational. Richard moving up closer to the water passing right over their diamond dome. It is, but I suspect, and George can confirm this for us during our next burst signal through the mantle, there may be more than one. BB alongside Jim. Computers? Jim looking over at the two standing side by side at the clear wall. Yes, not necessarily more of the 2048 variety. 1024s, BB motioning Jim closer. I believe there's only one of those, thankfully. Steve's brain is artificially intelligent, Jim adding. Yes, but he's only partially sentient, not at the level as the 2048. Steve is about to our level of processing abilities, BB looking Jim over. Whose? Richard not sure what to make of Beebe's visual examination of Jim. Yours and mine, Beebe turning to Richard. You're not including Jim? Richard looking over at him. No, Richard appearing rather solemn. Why not? Richard's voice rising. Because, and Jim, please don't take this wrong. However, I also believe you already know of what I'm referring. Beebe placing his right hand atop Jim's left shoulder. Yes, Steve told me. Jim giving them both a reassuring smile. Then let me in on the joke, will you? Richard not upset, only puzzled. Steve has been tutoring me, you might say. Jim beginning pacing of his own, not unlike how Richard was prone to doing. In return, I've helped him to grow and mature to the same age as myself, that of 33. I know, but what does that have to do with his capabilities in comparison to that monster 2048 out there? Richard feeling like pacing himself, but holding back. Steve and I have shared information. I've imparted upon him everything I've learned and experienced throughout my entire life, even my emotions. At the same time, he has passed over to me all the knowledge George has placed within his nanodiamond memory crystals. And all that he has gathered and continues to learn in real time. Jim coming to a halt across the 30-foot space from the two men. You two are linked up? Richard completely taken by the enormity of Jim's revelation. Beebe taking it in stride, having a better understanding of Steve's capabilities. Yes, not long after coming aboard, I sensed our commonality right away. Jim not sounding at all like the robot Richard was somehow now expecting. That whole diamond thing, I suppose. Richard realizing all of his computer background having become profoundly obsolete. Yes, Jim walking toward them. There wasn't a physical connection to the process. Really no need. Electromagnetic waves have carried and continue to all the information between Steve and myself. Like microwave transmissions, Richard regaining his composure. Yes. And Beebe, I agree as to your theory and belief in there being multiple 1024s on board that barge inside those shipping containers. Jim bringing up another hologram. This one of the 00100, and I'll put an image up for you guys to see. They were moved from Hangar 3 on Treasure Island in the San Francisco Bay, inside the hermetically sealed shipping containers. In fact, each was fully sealed by plasma welding. How many? Richard impressed. 7 more. Jim's voice sounding slightly mournful. Where do you think they'll be installed? Beebe, for once, at a loss for an answer. Steve and I agree. They'll follow the path set forth by the Apostle John's letters in the book of Revelation. Aw, come on, really? Richard stepping away from them. I mean, I'm a Christian believer and all, but why? Mirror images. Satan loves to replicate God's handiwork, but for his purposes of his own. Beebe assisting Jim. Richard not for the moment convinced, but curious. What locations then? John's letters covered a lot of territory, you know. I know, Beebe smiling. Richard throwing him a look, not quite sure what to make of the man's inflection to his voice. Jim begins by activating a holographic map, including topographic 3D features of the greater Mediterranean areas. The 7 churches, I'll go back to that map for you guys. The 7 churches located in present-day Turkey, each recipients of John's letters: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. He wrote them while exiled by the Roman Emperor Domitian to the desert isle of Patmos, here, Jim pointing to a small island off the coast of Turkey, south of Athens and north of Crete. You actually think they're going to follow along his postal route? Richard, not wanting to doubt the expansive knowledge gained by Jim by way of Steve. He did, however, question his reasoning. Yes, Jim looking Richard square in the eyes. Not looking away, he asked Beebe his opinion. What do you say, my friend? I agree with Jim. It follows an evil pattern set forth from before the time of Christ. A pattern of deceit. Beebe moving back and looking forward out through their diamond dome. One, we are charged with revealing to the world, or what's left of it, Richard watching the waves harmlessly crashing over the expansive dome, itself remaining perfectly dry due to their Higgs field. Looks like we're writing our own version of the book of Revelation. A modern one, Beebe turning, facing Richard and young Jim. Strategy, Richard. Something you know a lot more about than I. Richard somewhat taken aback by Beebe's comment. How do you see this playing out? What are their moves? Pausing a beat or two, Richard begins. If it were me, and seeing as how they've made their first move on the chessboard towards Cyprus, I'd say Patmos. Why is that? Jim interjecting. Diversionary move. Richard slowly, deliberately pacing. If what you guys say is true, and I do believe you are onto something here, they don't want us to see their real objective. At least, not until it's too late for us to do anything about it. Old magician's trick, eh? Beebe smiling. Yes, distract the audience with one hand while executing your real trick with the other. Richard moving in close to the hologram, picking up the model of the HMB-1. Steve, please make a model of the 00100 placed within the hold of the HMB-1. Immediately, Richard notices the heft of the model, nearly double. Thanks. Reaching inside the floating dry dock, he withdraws the new model of the barge, each of its cargo containers neatly stacked as a single unit atop its flat deck. This, my friends, is where things really get interesting. Now, I see what they're up to. Yes, Richard enjoying the process of unfolding what amounts to his opponent's strategy in a high-stakes chess match. Let me put that image back up for you. I'd move the HMB-1 with the barge and the 2048 to the Isle of Patmos. There, the HMB-1 having done its job in shielding it from the reconnaissance satellites and such, given their progress in creating the present state of chaos in the world, no one will be watching or noticing a barge carrying shipping containers crossing the Med. Very nice, Beebe appreciating what is developing, Jim only watching in silence. What happens to the containers once it reaches Patmos? It's essentially still a desert island, not many around to get in their way. I'd fly each one out by helicopter, Jim. You'll appreciate this. By CH-47 Chinook, specifically, Jim only nodding in acknowledgement of the irony, beginning with Ephesus and retracing John's route, and ending at Laodicea. Just like a mail carrier of the day, making his rounds in a large loop, Beebe appreciating the utter simplicity of it all. Exactly, Richard laughing. Jim moves in toward the map. The throne of Satan is here, pointing. Pergamon. Isn't that the same throne moved by the Germans to Berlin? Richard giving Jim room around the hologram. Yes, the Pergamum altar was in a temple dedicated to the Greek god Zeus. And yes, there is a connection back to Cyprus, Mount Olympus, the special domain of Zeus. The altar was shipped out of the Ottoman Empire from the original excavation site by a German archaeological team led by Karl Humann. It was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin in the 19th century. I know thy works, and where you dwell, even where Satan's throne is. BB quoting Revelation 2, verse 13. Don't leave it out of context, my friend, Jim adding. And you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Richard feeling uncomfortable with his own strategic plan, and pray it does not, BB encouraging them both. But that is not where the 2048 will become self-aware, Jim declares, resting his finger upon the solid model of Pergamon. However, it is where one of the 1024s, acting as a node, will link each of these computers with the Large Hadron Collider. Sentient with Satan, BB commands. The 2048 controlling the LHC through its new local network. Wow. Richard taking a further step back from the hologram. And then the portal opens, leading them back toward the ramp and the CNC room. Where are you going? BB back to his Aussie drawl. We got a fight on our hands, quickly disappearing down the ramp, Richard's words trailing. Sightseeing's over. The med was a mess, the powers that be having perfected their use of HARP and its cousins, the floating Nexrad rigs, scattered around the globe, resulting in the death of millions. Such is their continuing agenda, with the goal of eliminating 3/4 of the human race. Every nation's navies long since sinking from the surfaces of the seas. Steve arrives with impunity at the island of Cyprus. All stop, BB quietly orders from his centermost chair within the CNC room. Jim, slightly tilting his head left towards Jim, reviewing a stored satellite image of the isle, projected now as a hologram by Steve. Care to go swimming? Sure, nearly laughing at the prospect of using an old skill set from his youth. Ironic, isn't it? I passed on the opportunity of joining the U.S. Olympic swim team. Well, now you can swim in the shadow of Mount Olympus, BB rising out of his chair. Richard, gather your seals for a dip in the emerald seas, moving quickly aft towards Steve's main cargo hold, separate from the one containing the 2 Russian nuclear warheads. Calling back over his shoulder. Pick a spot. Let me put up another image for you guys. Jim's still seated before the holographic map. Here, Lara Beach, south of Akamas Peninsula National Park. Richard up and moving aft. Do you have a broad streak of irony running through you? Never one to have iron poor blood. Jim up and following them. Arriving in the cavernous cargo bay, Richard is pleased to see a full complement of familiar diving gear, including bubble-free CCUBA breathing units. BB interrupts him as he begins examining one of the backpack units. Won't need those. Why? What else you got? Richard only turning slightly. Not Alon Bodner's like a fish system, I hope. I mean, I like it, but I suspect you have another one of your surprises up the sleeve of your wetsuit. Richard beginning to appreciate all the technology he's being introduced to. Nope, we've moved beyond the bounds of Bodner and his application of Henry's law. No centrifuges as gills pulling oxygen from seawater. Richard handing both Jim and Richard slightly oversized diving masks. I call this, and yes, it's my own design, the Reds. BB facing the 2 men as the remainder of the SEAL Team 7 enters the compartment. This is the Redundant External Diver System Mask, or Reds. Richard taking it up in both hands, closely reviewing the interior surfaces surrounding the slightly curved faceplate. What's the redundant part of it? My play on words, I'm afraid, Beebe handing one to each of the men. This is not a rebreather in the typical sense. It does not scrub carbon dioxide or have you rebreathe unused oxygen. Yet, like a CCUBA, it's bubble-free. No tanks or hoses? One of the team asks. None. Just the mask itself. Beebe pulling on what amounted to a flexible hood and faceplate, motioning for the others to do likewise. What are we breathing then? Richard adjusting beneath his square chin. Whatever it is tasteless and odorless, realizing they're communicating via a built-in system. Remember the DS red crystals? Beebe moving toward a small, elaborately sealed cargo box, finally opening it, withdrawing another sealed stainless steel container, much like a thermos bottle. Spinning off the top, he sprinkles a few grams into it, appearing first pink, then gradually black as the crystals begin absorbing oxygen. That'll suck all the oxygen out of the room, a seal announces. Exactly, Beebe smiling through his faceplate, and upon demand, it releases it. How? Richard unperturbed, expecting as much from the man. The crystals themselves act as a sensor within your mask, coupled with a typical pressure sensor detecting each inhalation. The negative pressure generated by the expansion of your lungs activates tiny laser emitters. The light triggers the release of oxygen from the cobalt metal crystals. Beebe pouring the remainder of the pink crystals upon the steel deck of the air and watertight cargo hold. Pointing up toward the ceiling, Richard continues, Don't worry, Steve is our backup man. He is replacing the oxygen being absorbed in order to maintain normal atmospheric pressure in here. If need be, he can instantly flood the compartment with normal air mixture. Good, another of the SEALs remarks, watching the pink cobalt turn an ominous black. This was first developed, as I've said, at the University of Southern Denmark. Then a mate of mine at Sydney University in Australia adapted these to work in the mask he and I designed for me and now you. So, you used these before? Richard impressed as he continues breathing normally without noting any delays or restrictions. Of course, but you guys are to be the first to put the technology in the field, or should I say, in the ocean. Beebe beginning to retrieve the crystals in his bare hands, replacing them back inside the stainless steel container. As you can see, nothing toxic about the stuff. A few grams is equal to a lungful of oxygen, like a form of solid hemoglobin, only using cobalt instead of iron. Where are they? Another SEAL asks. Screwing back the cap, Richard smiles through his faceplate. Inside the synthetic material around your faceplate. The double-walled hood holds 3 times as much oxygen as 2 of your typical pressurized dive tanks, the crystals themselves serving as a redundant backup system. What about the external part of its nomenclature? Richard quickly performing his usual pacing about, testing the inhalation restriction of the mask. If all that weren't enough, mate, here's the real kicker. Beebe moving a second stainless container over to a heavy glass one filled with seawater. Opening both, he dumps the pink crystals into the water, quickly sealing the 5-gallon container. Immediately, they turn from pink to deep black. Cool, one of the SEALs calls out. You mean it sucked the oxygen out of the water? Richard moving in close to the container. Yes, now watch. Beebe withdrawing from a wall-mounted storage compartment a standard laser pointer. Turning it on, he aims it at the black crystals. It traces out its own pathway, visible as a pink trail inside the glass container. If I keep doing this until I hit all of the crystals, as do the numerous laser emitters inside the walls of your masks, they'll all return to pink while releasing oxygen back into the seawater, or into the alveoli of our lungs, Jim finally speaking up. You sound like you've known about this all along, Richard turning back from the glass container toward Jim standing across the cargo hold. You're forgetting. What Steve knows, I know, Jim smirking. And I know all about your new toys, Steve announces. Time to go, boys. The world outside the Manta submarine significantly had changed since their disembarking from the former Mare Island Naval Shipyard in San Francisco Bay. Becoming readily apparent to all aboard, despite Steve's mammoth 300-foot wingspan, each was feeling small and insignificant in the face of the mission before them. Other than the team back at Georgia's Oklahoma silo facility, the crew members were unknown to the remainder of the world's population. The enemy unleashed technologies designed to geoengineer the planet, suitable to their liking. Their new race, transhumanists as they were known, in reality, hybrids of the labs. Beginning with the atmosphere, the course of the jet streams were altered, and with it the globe's weather, sometimes employed as a weapon, more predominantly to achieve large reductions in populations. Laced with metals and biologicals, progressively the air was becoming toxic to all not accepting the newly created vaccines, initiating false pandemics, creating worldwide fear. The public of each continent was beginning to rise up in demand of the vaccines. Such are the nature of these psychological operations. Specifically and finally, the false hope of protection from Ebola. Few knowing of the United States' own Center for Disease Control holding the patent for this man-modified virus, truly a beast in its own right, and like its creators, a hybrid of laboratory genetically modified DNA. Unlike the Nephilim, giants in the days of Noah, these viruses occupied a microscopic world, and yet their impact far outstripping their similarly genetically modified cousins killed off in Noah's flood. Today, there would be no mass extinction by water. It would, however, arise over the course of 7 years. The means and mechanisms in achieving it coming in varied forms, ending in one final stroke and sweep of mankind. The promise of a new world, a new kingdom upon the earth, ruled only by one. Man strived for one of his own design, his own making, of his own intellect. The vaccines man created in his laboratories to combat the disease he himself made, serving two purposes: death or enslavement by corrupting the very seed of man, his DNA. Insidiously, all those partaking of the promised protection, if not suffering death, immediately rendered unaware of their own enslavement, a serf class, meant only to serve the elite of their envisioned world, worker bees tending to the single world leader in the new hive. Such will it be, a hive mentality. Anyone choosing not to join in the collective, first viewed as outcasts, quickly then as mortal enemies of the collective, marked for execution both as protection and inducement of others toward compliance. Unknown to the elite, they too have fallen prey, a grand deception befalling them. At first believing the age-old lie, Satan's promise of achieving immortality, if only one should partake in the tree of forbidden knowledge. Man believed the first lie, seeking everlasting life through the changing of his seed. Today, science of its own creation, genetic modification. Believing he possesses the intellect to live forever, even as a god. The elite, too, will suffer at the hands of the one they've sworn allegiance to, Satan. Such is their nature, their choice. They've been fooled. Blindness caused by pride, hubris rendering them slaves of a grander scale than those chosen to enslave. BB, Richard standing by his SEAL team, and Jim in the large airlock chamber. A question been rattling around in my head since we met. Sure, mate, delaying again the pulling down of the dive mask over his face. Each of the team nearly encircling the two leaders, likewise delaying of theirs. Why did George create Steve? Richard face to face with BB. How about if we let his son field that kick? BB leaning past toward Jim standing just behind Richard. Sure, Jim moving up alongside. I'll make this short. Sub-launched, nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. All other launch platforms, including, I might add, silos like ours back in Oklahoma, having been rendered obsolete as well as vulnerable. Richard moving away from Jim and BB closer to the airlock leading to the med. I know all that. Remember, I'm still a SEAL and spent a lot of time on board nuke boats. Turning back to face all the men arrayed in the compartment. I thought Steve was unarmed, a proof of concept prototype. The best defense is a better offense, BB laughing, although mindful of the seriousness of their mission. Meaning, Richard leaning against the diamond doorway. And don't tell me about those two old rusky nukes either. Nope, nukes are obsolete. BB looking over at Jim. Dark energy and dark matter. Nodding. Doesn't exist in our dimension, Richard scowling. It does, and at the same time doesn't. Jim moving closer to Richard. We cannot separate ourselves from what comprises the majority of the known universe. We can, however, tap into it. Steve is proof. That's George's proof of concept, then. Looking directly at Jim's eyes, as if expecting to see another example of his continuing development, reminding himself there is no such thing as true evolution. It's not so much Steve as it is moving into another dimension. Through the matrix of the Higgs field, Richard pausing. Yes, Jim not the least bit bothered by Richard's visual examination. Scientists have succeeded, as you know, in tapping into other dimensions by way of the adiabatic quantum computer. Still, they've not been able to identify exactly how they've achieved this remarkable feat. They only know they have, and it's repeatable. BB adding, the beauty of this is they cannot enter the same dimension more than once due to their lack of marking or identifying any specific one of them. Why? Richard following them. Jim smiled broadly. Like I've said, too many. Infinite, in fact. I know, Richard straightening up, but that's no weapon system. BB appreciating Richard's position. Like in your American football, we can do an end run round them, though. Big deal, Richard folding his arms while still leaning against Steve's diamond skin. What did you use at Alcatraz? BB casting a look out over the entire crew, both his and Richard's. 24 in total. Pushing himself off from Steve. You're right, I'd forgotten about the cases your guys stowed aboard. Old George is something else. Yes, Jim pulling down his diving mask over his face, his words barely audible to the others not yet affixing their own, thereby devoid of their communication system. Micro-accelerators, a broad smile visible through his faceplate. Due to the continuing storms, the team had determined the best course of action is to approach from the west side of Cyprus at Lara Beach. I'll put that back up. The HMB-1 having dropped its anchors northeast off the Isle of Patmos. Richard leads two of his SEALs and Jim through the airlock. Freed of any cumbersome dive gear, including wetsuits due to the rising sea temperatures, they step out 60 feet below the surface of the Med. Utilizing their mask's internal communication system, they remain in constant contact with Steve. "Godspeed, mates," Beebe floating in a standing position just outside Steve's airlock door. "Contact when you hit the beach. Stay close. We may need a fast ride," Richard shaking Beebe's hand in the waters, murky from the storm raging over their heads. "Still, Steve will sit on the bottom until you need us," Beebe encouraging each SEAL. "Too bad he's not amphibious," Richard letting his words drift and fade. Beebe's big teeth somehow glinting through his faceplate. Richard, taking it in stride, rotates vertically 180 degrees, then swimming up and horizontally over, leading two of his team and Jim for the beach, 3 miles distant. Not really necessary given the nature of their unique communication system. The SEALs, by nature and training, maintain their silence, each man finding their newfound form of underwater breathing completely unrestricted, even a little easier by virtue of the slightly pressurized filling of their lungs via the DS red crystals. They experience none of the typical initial cracking effort when first inhaling through a normal regulator. Likewise unrestricted, their exhalations taken up by a slight vacuum. The net effect was that of a low-powered hospital's artificial lung machine. The faceplate displaying a magnehelic gauge by way of a heads-up projection. Additionally, depth, pressure, elapsed time, and compass headings. Touching a set of 4 buttons reproduced along each side of the top of their mask, the diver digitally obtains information from databases linked directly with Steve. Voice communication relegated to a redundant status. A small LiDAR unit mounted atop the faceplate providing range to the beach, as well as any other selected target. Alongside an infrared sensor assisting in the darkened areas beneath the sea's surface. Opposite is their night vision light amplification system. All 3 working together provide each diver with clear, unobstructed vision, no matter the light or water conditions. Finally, a miniature sonar device, mimicking that of a dolphin. The faceplate can become cluttered, putting the diver into a state of sensory overload. Anticipating this, Beebe briefed the SEALs and Jim prior to entering the airlock compartment aboard Steve. Leaving 8 of his men aboard Steve, Richard, kicking his long swim fins, catches up with 2 of his SEALs and Jim, the Med's bottom quickly rising beneath their steady progress. Appreciating the heads-up display's ability to digitally illuminate their liquid environment, wishing only he'd had this technology in missions past. Devoid of any other forms of propulsion, Steve having deposited them in close proximity of Lara Beach, making delivery of the 2 micro-accelerators an easy task. Richard, amused from behind his faceplate, considered how suddenly breaking the surface and body surfing to the pristine white beach ahead would be received by the locals and tourists, had there been any alive to witness their arrival. The solemn reality bringing back his determined focus. During the swim in, briefly, a conversation with the newest member of his team flashed as if projected in his heads-up display. Not a rookie, but a well-seasoned veteran of several overseas deployments. Yet he felt compelled to ask his captain. Not a subject to be spoken of outside their tight-knit community, he asked. Not because he himself had changed, only because the world he'd known was rapidly shifting away from what had been their frame of reference and their reality, to one of spatial intrusions on a vast scale. Fear. He knew how to use it as a catalyst to move forward and to focus on the mission at hand. It was a tool, not unlike the short-bladed, Benchmade brand punch knife each carried on today's mission. Their warrior culture looked at fear of The warrior culture looked at a fear of shame or dishonor as more powerful than any fear of injury or even death. Richard had explained to the younger man that courage is doing what needs to be done in spite of one's fears. It is a complex relationship between the elite and experienced warrior and his fear. The elite warrior develops beyond young bravado into having an intimate relationship with fear. It's not about denying fear, but using it to make one stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Seeking the next opportunity to see what one is made of, each developing and shaping their own relationship with it. The young man knew he and the team had to be ready to act when bold and dangerous action was required. Richard reminding him that discretion is often the better part of valor. The essence of fear is making it work for one, rather than allowing it to hinder performance. In fact, fear can be a warrior's friend. Properly managed and applied, it can inspire focused attention to detailed and thorough preparation before a stressful event. One develops an intimate and familiar relationship with fear. Experience, self-knowledge, and common sense help one to talk to and to listen to his fear, and thereby to perform at his best. His biggest fear as a member of a team is fear of letting down his teammates and his team. Richard let him know it was okay to acknowledge fear. It was experience, judgment, and wisdom that temper and manage his primal fears. All the while, fear providing focus to his mind and energies, telling him when to be careful and when to pay very close attention. Given their new world, Richard highlighted it was their intelligence as well as bravery that would ensure success and survival. 4 bodies surfed through the rough water beating upon the once idyllic sands, where only a short time previous tourists frolicked. The formerly pristine beach, famous for its turtles, was strewn with the wreckage of numerous small craft and much larger ships. Ominous was Jim's reaction. Each carried a small waterproof case measuring 2 feet square and 12 inches deep. Aside from their punch knives and 10mm Glock 29s, it contained their weapon of choice. George's incredible micro-accelerators, particle accelerators to be exact, appearing innocently enough as quarter-sized stainless steel ball bearings, each capable of tearing into and apart any man-made object of any material, including George's own invention, nanodiamond structures. The concept being rather simple in development, the trick was in achieving both its scalability and deliverability. Typical accelerators, like Stanford's linear accelerators, use microwaves to boost the energy of electrons. At first, George, deep inside his own Oklahoma silo, used commercial lasers to accelerate electrons to near light speed. Then he focused them into a half-micron high channel within a fused silica glass chip a half-millimeter in length. The channel was shaped into precisely spaced nanoscale ridges. Infrared laser light shining on the ridges generated electrical fields that interacted with the electrons within the channel, boosting their energy. Initially, George produced an accelerator on glass chips measuring 100 feet in length. This produced the equivalent accelerating power of Stanford's 2-mile-long linear accelerator, and more than 1 million more electron pulses per second. The level of acceleration gradient exceeded 300 million electron volts per meter. Each of the stainless steel balls the 4-man team carried with them produced over 1 billion electron volts within their quarter-sized diameters. Contained inside the waterproof cases were 100 of these balls. In total, 400 of George's little devices. Transport, Richard directing the three men to search the abandoned vehicles along the Lara Beach restaurant for at least one in good running order. After several attempts at starting the first few, Jim succeeds in starting a relic of World War II. Good old Pee-wee, Jim calling out to the team through the broken driver's window of the old Dodge Power Wagon as it coughs and belches blue smoke from beneath its rusted hulk. Richard climbs aboard in the passenger seat of the narrow cab. Crap, I can see the beach, gesturing through the heavily rusted floor at sand. The other two SEALs finding much the same in the truck's bed. Laughing, Jim eases out the old clutch in first gear, causing it to lurch heavily forward and making the worn steering wheel spin through his fingers as the front wheels self-straightened. Rolling only a few feet forward, quickly he shifts lightly into second through the non-synchromesh transmission. Good old crash box tranny. They never break. Better not, it's all we've got, Richard gagging on the exhaust fumes pouring up through the nearly transparent floor. Jim almost colliding with a corner of the restaurant, caught off guard by the sight out of his right peripheral vision of Richard now wearing his dive mask. Slowly, Jim thread the old four-wheel drive pickup along the rough, rock-strewn path, disguising itself as a road, as it twisted in a narrow switchback up the hillside overlooking the beach. Finally reaching what passed as a main road, consisting still of dirt, albeit somewhat smoother, Jim floored the old flathead engine as again he slipped the naked shift lever into fourth gear. Still laughing at Richard, Jim never having a chance himself at donning his own dive mask. Richard, using the mast heads-up display, examines the holographic map projected at what appears to be a few inches in front of his faceplate. The truck gaining additional speed. On a downslope, Jim slips the transmission into neutral, allowing it to freewheel as fast as the wobbly front wheels would tolerate. Having a spare hand, he too slips on his dive mask, making it not only easier to breathe on the dusty road, but as well to communicate with his teammates. Where to? Pointing up the dry, rock-strewn hills. Up. Still think Mount Olympus? Jim paying attention to the large potholes appearing out of nowhere as they round another sharp bend in the hillside. Yep, Richard pressing one of the buttons along the top right side of the hood portion of his dive mask. Steve, you copy? Calmly and deliberate. Yes, Richard. Clearly tracking your onboard video feed, Steve replies with equal aplomb. Any threat detection? Looking upward out of the broken passenger window. There is. I suggest you find faster transport, BB breaking in. Ideas where? Jim checking a shattered side mirror. No, improvise, BB serious. We'll just keep an eye out. About all we can do, Richard fighting the truck's nearly out-of-control motions. Jim basically letting the truck find its own way along the beaten roadway, littered with debris from what looked like an aerial assault of some kind. None of the damage looked familiar to the four men. Expected was the outwardly explosive tearing of structures and vehicles. Rather, they appeared imploded upon themselves, as if sucking inward. Where are the bodies? Jim expecting Richard to have all the answers. Beats me, but we'll find out soon enough. Sure the enemy knows we're here, Richard scanning through the dust kicked up behind them. There, Jim slamming on the brakes, their metal-on-metal squeal tearing into their eardrums. Why aren't they damaged? Look sharp, guys, Richard rolling out of the battered cab. Probably dumped them here not long ago. A half-dozen new four-wheel drive quads randomly parked nearby what had been a gasoline station and small grocery store. Circling the imploded building, carefully they search for signs of men or anything else passing as a threat. Finding none, Richard motions them to the quads. Remove the fuel tanks from those two and bring them. Jim, see if any fuel cans are around. A few moments later, he returns with 4. Drain the truck's tank into them. Richard tossing Jim a long screwdriver he found behind the truck's seat. Finding the machines in perfect working order, as quietly and carefully as possible, they begin the long climb up into the dry, rock-strewn mountains. It was going to be long and tough ride. Their concerns were twofold: remaining concealed and having enough fuel to reach the summit of Mount Olympus. SEALs operated, of course, over land, not only water. None were averse to mountain climbing, if it came to that. The sweltering heat made wearing their dive masks nearly impossible, preferring to hold it to their faces as needed to communicate or breathe through the billowing dust. Even if a trail existed, Richard chose charting an unbroken path through rocks and frequent towering boulders, less chance of encountering the enemy making use of one. They'd hit the beach just before sunrise. Even then, the heat was abnormally high due to the artificial heating of the atmosphere, it being trapped by the heavy layers of aerosolized spraying of barium and cesium and strontium and aluminum, along with a host of biological agents. Midday was just too much to bear, even for these above-average men. There, Richard pointing to a large overhanging rock formation. Run 'em inside. They parked the 4 quads and themselves beneath the jutting rock roof, appreciating the relative coolness it provided them. Lacking backpacks, even canteens, choosing to travel as light as feasible, they had no water. One of the SEALs instinctively crawls to the rear of the rock formation and begins digging with his short-bladed punch knife into the soft sands. Having to create what amounted to a 6-foot-long slit trench, allowing him to pull large amounts of sand away from the rock wall, he achieves a depth of 3 feet. There he strikes moisture. Not much, but it'll do. Placing his shirt into the damp hole, it quickly wicks it up. Richard directs the second SEAL to place his upturned dive mask beneath, as his teammate wrings out the liquid. "We need to keep moving," Richard scanning the terrain below and around them, the med stretching out, not in its characteristic blue, this time a dull and dirty mud. The sound was unbearable. It came from nowhere and all around. Perhaps the overhanging rock structure was enhancing the effect upon the team. Richard, not wanting to stick around and find out, waves the others to mount up and move out on their quads. Focused on traversing along the hillside, they find a break in the large rocks, allowing them access to climb. The sound continued, not changing. They chose to ignore it, despite the pain in their eardrums. Soon, each man's ear canals dripping with blood. Richard had given hand signals to don their dive masks, hoping the hood incorporated with the faceplates might somehow reduce the decibel level. It did not. Worse, the sound effectively cutting off all verbal communications between themselves, as well as Steve. Texting by way of the buttons redundantly placed on each side of the top of his hood, he asks, "Can you stop noise?" Steve, "Located source. Next rad platform, near coastline. Moving." A slight rippling of the leading edges. Steve's hull body comes to life beneath the soft seabed. As if shaking himself loose, sand cascades from his hydrodynamic back. In a matter of moments, he's accelerated to over 80 knots. At 40 feet beneath the waves, he leaves not a ripple upon the surface. Within a few minutes, BB takes manual control of Steve. "Let's scare the crap out of these guys." Breaking through the surface of the low waves moving across the windy med, Steve's hemispherical clear diamond dome is exposed. BB and his 2 crew members handle the holographic controls as they watch the rapidly enlarging view of the floating platform, its own white geodesic radar dome glistening in the day's heat. "Plan?" one of the 2 crew asks. No plan. Like I told Richard a while ago, improvise." BB banking Steve hard to starboard and then to port, causing each tip of each wing to break the sea's surface. At a width of 300 feet, Steve presented a more impressive display than any breaching whale could have achieved. From inside their clear dome, they could see other men, the enemy, excitedly gathering to the platform's railings. A small opening appearing in their white geodesic dome, clearly a missile launcher, could be seen gliding out onto the open deck. None of Steve's crew remarked as to this new development. Settling now flat upon the sea's surface, BB slows Steve to a dead ahead. The 3-foot waves breaking over the smooth surfaces of his spreading wings. Then all stop. Steve merely bobbing 100 yards from the threat. Richard, through his dive mask, utilizes the faceplate as binoculars, the video camera reaching out over the sea, bringing into sharp view the events taking place offshore. A bit of showmanship, eh, BB, old boy? Speaking to himself, the literal ear-splitting tone continuing unabated. Motioning to the others, they watch. The missile launches. Due to the close proximity BB has selected in halting Steve, it must climb straight up. Arching over at an altitude of 1,000 feet, it retraces its original trajectory, causing the enemy crew to run in all directions. At the last moment, altering direction a few degrees, it impacts close to where the hatch was through which the 2 Russian nukes came aboard Steve, although there was no outline of a hatch now visible. The explosion reverberated over to Richard and his team. None heard it. The eardrums, long ago ruptured. They watched. The smoke and vaporized seawater cleared in the stiff sea breeze. Steve was gone. Richard and the others knew it was a game BB was playing. Unfazed, fully aware of Steve's impervious nanodiamond construction following the enemy's nuclear testing of the day before. Moments pass. There, Jim calling out, unheard and pointing toward the next rad platform. He began listing to starboard. Not that the right side pontoon was so much sinking as it was acting as a pivot point. Steve was rising from beneath the port side pontoon, upon which the vertical legs supported the flat platform deck. Weighing in at several million pounds of steel and equipment, Steve's performance, indeed, impressed the SEALs watching from their mountainside perch. The forward end of the port pontoon resting directly upon the unseen spot left by the missile's ineffectual impact on Steve's back. BB and his crew watched from inside the clear dome forward of the pontoon's tip as Steve fully surfaced. The enormous double pontoon platform rose above their heads. Menacingly, his tail rose from beneath the sea, now appearing like a scorpion, more like a scorpion than a manta ray. Men could be seen jumping from the platform's tilting deck. At over 100 feet, the fall itself proving fatal. BB moved the tip of Steve's tail directly up beneath the now elevated port side of the platform's flat deck. Richard, for once in his military career, could not believe what transpired next. With what seemed a mere flick of his tail, Steve flipped the floating platform, radar dome and all. Not designed for such a position, quickly it sank, leaving only floating debris and bodies in its wake. The sound ceased. Pulling off their dive masks, Richard using his to text Steve. Thanks. Steve, my pleasure. Pointing the way back up the mountainside, silently Richard and the team mount their quads. An hour later, their supply of fuel runs as dry as their throats. Still relegated to hand signals and texting between them, they continue up through the rock-strewn mountainside. Jim, used sound to drive people away. Richard, yes. At dark, use infrared to spot enemy. Jim, using sinking as diversion. Send Steve. Richard, Richard texts Beebe, beat feet, Patmos, 7 churches. Their plan was to rendezvous with the enemy at Patmos. 7 of the 8 adiabatic quantum computers Steve detected were ready to be offloaded from the barge carried inside the HMB-1. The 8th already on board a drone, 4-rotor cargo helicopter. A larger 16-rotor drone aircraft carrier, having ferried as a group all 8 drones from the MBB helicopter factory in Germany to Patmos. The beauty of the HMB-1's design was not only could it submerge, allowing its inner deck to receive the floating barge and its arrangement of shipping containers stacked aboard, it was equipped with a sliding multi-section roof. Let me put an image up for you. Their plans changed at the sinking of the NexRad platform off Cyprus. The enemy intended moving the barge under the guise of a vessel carrying ordinary shipping containers from Patmos to Cyprus, there offloading and flying each container to its final destination, sort of a bait and switch, one each to the locations in Turkey of the 7 former biblical churches the Apostle John addressed his letters to, the ones resulting in the book of Revelation. Patmos was merely a diversion, Beebe and Steve having provided one of their own. The first drone quadcopter airlifted through the open roof the soon-to-be sentient 2048 computer. The remaining 7 shipping containers, plasma welded together for integrity during transit, needed to be cut apart. This required the disgorging of the barge from HMB-1's belly. The enemy now was in scramble mode. Beebe's text reply, we beat wings, you feet, 2048 airborne, your location. Jim and the other 2 SEALs, copied in on Richards and Beebe's exchange, accelerate their pace climbing the mountain. Nightfall as first the navigation lights of the quadcopter, its shipping container tucked up in its belly between the 4 rotors, are seen long before it's heard by the team. Richard, kill IR, go night vision as it passes. They were tucked into the rocks overlooking the paved access road leading to the former British radar station atop 6,404-foot Mount Olympus. It had been 4 hours since their last water back at the rock outcropping. The large 4-rotor quadcopter moved effortlessly to the peak of Mount Olympus, settling in between 3 geodesic radomes, its shipping container aboard, the landing gear compressing beneath their weight. They watched through the darkness the ghostly images afforded by the dive mask's night vision function. Relayed via onboard video, Beebe and his crew followed the enemy's progress in offloading the 2048 computer from inside its ordinary shipping container. Housed in a flat black cube, itself difficult to make out even with night vision, Richard, switching back to infrared, found it gave off little in the way of heat. If not for the men moving it, in the night the box would have gone nearly invisible. One of 2 green roll-up doors momentarily opening, allowing the box rapid entry into the concrete bunker building in front of a camo-painted geodesic radar dome. A second all-white dome sat to its rear, with an identical but smaller 3rd dome off to one side. Jim laughed at whomever decided it was necessary to paint the one in camo. The ensuing hours of climbing at altitude and the ceasing of the sound piercing their ears, the change in barometric pressure having relieved the strain on their eardrums. You hear me? Richard speaking softly to Jim and the other 2 men. Yes, sick of texting. Jim pointing toward the top of his dive mask, but appreciating the extra supply of oxygen a dive mask affording him. Good, me too. Obviously, we need to get inside the bunker before that thing goes live. Richard opening the case of micro accelerators he'd carried over 6,000 feet up the mountain. Really? Jim totally sarcastic. Since you're the brains of this outfit, any ideas? Usually we SEALs just go in and blow stuff up. Richard in a self-deprecating voice. Funny, Jim using his faceplate for a close-up view. We have the MAs. Yeah, but I want to hold off using them for the cube itself. Richard, seeing they were in good order, closes and secures the lid on his case. Crystals, one of the two SEALs offers. Of course, Jim smiling, hitting the man in the shoulder, drops some down one of those ventilator shafts inside it. How much do we need? That place isn't airtight. Richard texting Steve to access the building schematics and send them to his mask's head-up display. Steve, listening to their communications while running top speed underwater to Patmos, verbally answers his question. The contents of 3 of your 4 masks is more than sufficient for the actual computer room, keeping 1 in reserve. The internal building diagram Steve projects to each man's faceplate suggest another diversion. Why not the second large radome? It looks like a golf ball. Got a driver? Jim smiling at the other. Richard, switching off the building diagram, enhances his video feed to an area alongside and down the slope from the largest dome. Spotting a ski chairlift, he has an idea. Got snow? An impish grin broadening across his scruffy face. No, one of the SEALs growls. Let's get down from here, to one of those towers. Oh, this'll be good. Richard, more of a kid than a warrior, as he bounces down the soft sand soils mixed with small rocks. Jim shrugs and follows. Reaching nearby the base of a tower just outside the tall fence surrounding the facility, they take cover behind a pile of rocks groomed from the ski run areas. Jim sees it too. The chairlift, stupidly I might add, runs directly over that one small corner where the 2 fence lines come together. We cut away a long section of that concertina wire from atop the fence itself and attach it to a chair. Directing one of the SEALs. That shack over there houses the controls, including, I'd bet, a remote starter for the chairlift engine down the mountain. No one up here will even hear it running. Get in there and report. Beauty, Jim shaking his head in agreement. And the other end? To the large golf ball. We'll drag that dome right over their radar. Richard pointing out the route it will fall. A few minutes later, one SEAL gaining entry to the shack acknowledges the presence of the remote starter and momentarily activates it. Finding all is in order, he reports his findings back to Richard. The 3 men move along the fence line in the now moonless night, with an incoming cloud cover providing additional concealment to their operation. Cutting away with their punch knives the thin banding holding the concertina wire to the top of the fencing, letting it fall toward the dome. Jim climbs the fence at the designated corner where the chairlift will overhang. Outside the fence, Richard texts the SEAL in the control shack to start the chairlift's engine, moving a chair into position at the corner. Richard and the 4th SEAL move their end of the wire forward, arriving at the chair, which is situated over the opposite side of the fence line. Tossing the end over, they continue until all the remaining wire is fully clear of the fence. Meanwhile, Jim has been dragging his end of the wire up a short slope to the largest dome. Arriving, quickly he encircles the entire base with the wire, finally attaching it back to itself, forming a noose. Giving Richard a thumbs up, he slides back down, rejoining them at the fence. Requiring all 3 of their over 6-foot heights, they stand one atop the other's shoulders, effectively forming a 3-man totem pole of sorts, and their 3rd SEAL standing at the top. Richard forming the base. The seal wrapping an end of the concertina wire through and around the chair's frame. Regaining their footing on the dome side of the fence, each man scrambles up the slope, concealing themselves behind the smaller of the three domes. Richard texts the go signal to their teammate inside the control shack, while telling Jim and his seal to begin cutting into their dive masks. Finally, whispering for them to activate the miniature laser emitters inside the linings, thus releasing all the oxygen from the crystals. Their red color returns, indicating each is again ready to begin absorbing oxygen. Quickly, because already the crystals are reabsorbing oxygen from the normal atmosphere, they dump them into one of the airtight cases, once housing a set of the micro-accelerators, their pockets now bulging with the quarter-sized stainless steel balls. Pointing to a hood covering one of the several ventilators in the bunker roof, they move toward it, Richard checking on his faceplate, it being the one previously identified from the internal building diagram. Steve, watching their video feed, confirms also by text to each of them. Jim opens the airtight case, efficiently pouring out handfuls to his two fellow saboteurs. They in turn shove the tiny crystals through the fine mesh screening covering the ventilator's hood. Completing their task, they return to the concealment afforded by the smaller radome. Richard texts, "Go." Silently, the chairlift begins moving forward, its engine far below the radomes. The concertina wire rises as one end is being pulled along by the chair. Moments pass as it goes taut, causing a hesitation in the chairlift. The question going through each of their minds, will the wire be stronger than the structure holding up the radome? The seal in the shack goes full power, pegging the engine's throttle, allowing it to rev up into redline on the tachometer display, but not so quickly as to snap the wire. He feels it as the strain is first taken up by the chairlift's own cable system, then goes full throttle. Not designed for such abuse, chairs begin bouncing wildly up and down, some nearly touching the ground, others close to towers. The seals fear some will strike, causing the hollow tube structures to resound like low-toned church bells in the mountains. A tremendous snap is heard, followed by several others in unison as the lightweight tubular framework forming the Buckminster Fuller designed domes give way within the wire noose strangling it. It collapses upon the rotating radar dome formerly protected by its collapsing shield, effectively becoming entangled, its drive mechanism at first seizing up, then as circuit breakers trip, all power is cut to its electric motor. The concertina wire having finally snapped upon entanglement with the antenna, its job completed. The noise is gut-wrenching and intense to all except the four seals. It is welcomed and their signal to enter the bunker beneath the camo-painted radome. And I think that's where we will stop for the night. Cliffhanger. We shall see, we shall see, we shall see what these guys will do. I'll check the chat room. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was entertaining. All right, guys. So, the voice is going away. I think it's a good place to stop. It gets pretty fast-paced. I'll just let you know. The remainder of the book moves along very, very quickly. So I think Sunday, if my wife will allow me to, I will finish the book on Sunday. Sunday evening, fireside chat. Fireside chat with the novel, okay? Alrighty. Well, thank you everyone in the chat room for your kind words, and we will talk to you on Sunday. Prayers for everyone, and I hope you have a pleasant weekend. Good night.